Hello, and welcome to Church and Main, a podcast for people interested in the intersection of faith, politics, and culture. I'm Dennis Sanders, your host. Maybe you've heard me say this joke before, but my parents were both what I would call New Deal Democrats. They were union members, auto workers, and I like to say and joke that these two diehard New Deal Democrats gave birth to an Eisenhower Republican. And while that joke is funny, there's a bit of sadness underneath, because I think that both of those kinds of Democrats and Republicans, kind of the moderate Rockefeller Republican and the more kind of working class New Deal Democrat, conservative Democrat, doesn't really exist much anymore. I remember I interned on Capitol Hill back in the 1990s, actually, to be exact, 1990. And these kind of people really roamed the halls in numbers, in large numbers. And they were able to work together, and I think they were able to produce some awesome legislation. And that's not the case anymore. It just seems overall that there seems to be little room for more pragmatic liberals and conservatives who want to work together and, even live together. More and more conservatives and liberals live and work separately. This is kind of part of our increasing political polarization. Back in 2008, there was a writer called Bill Bishop. He wrote a book. It was a bestseller called The Big Sort. And it talked about how we are sorting to actually segregating ourselves into like-minded communities. And that's only has worsened since 2008. And one political writer really thinks, that I've read recently, really thinks that nothing good can come of this. In December 2024, right after that presidential election, Michael Baharaeen wrote in the Liberal Patriot about his worries concerning the increasing polarization of America. And he wrote the following, quote, "One of the more distressing developments over the past couple of decades has been America's worsening political and cultural polarization. American identities today are more rooted in partisan affiliation and social class than in the past, which has created new fault lines in public life," unquote. And he continues on how this affects the future of our republic. Quote, "As many Americans start to more deeply embrace these identities, they risk becoming estranged from their fellow citizens who vote, think, and live differently, and less likely to encounter non-caricatured versions of them. Over time, this can produce higher levels of intergroup hostility and mistrust. What might have once been considered minor, if still meaningful disagreements about a certain issue or policy, may now seem like existential battles for the soul of the nation." This sounds pretty familiar, doesn't it? So, Michael Baharaeen is my guest today. And before that, our conversation a little bit about Michael. He is the chief political analyst for the Liberal Patriot, which is, sadly, was a great Substack that was trying to work to bring and swing, hopefully, the Democrats back to a more, I won't say centrist, but definitely to a party that was more focused on economic issues, especially towards the working class. Unfortunately, that Substack, which has been around now for about 6 years, shut down because sadly they could not find an audience anymore. But hopefully we will see more things from Michael. But in the meantime, he is a native of Kansas City, currently lives in Atlanta, and writes another Substack, his own, called Checks and Balances on Substack. Now, a little bit of a note, there are times when I don't talk about faith on this podcast. This is one of those times. And while faith is not mentioned here, this is important for the church. As Christians, we believe in the ministry of reconciliation. We believe in gathering, especially around a communion table, and where it doesn't really matter what party we belong to, but we live in a world where that does matter. So as Christians, we need to be about thinking about how this affects us and how we can be a witness to a better way. So, with all that out of the way, let's hear about the dangers of political polarization in America and what we can do about it in this discussion with Michael Baharaeen. Well, I wanted to start off by just getting to know a little bit about you. I know that I learned about you as being a writer for the Liberal Patriot, but to know a little bit more about you.
Sure. Well, thanks for having me. So I have been working in politics for probably about 13 years now. A lot of my work has been analytical. I do a lot of analysis of elections, national politics, state level politics, and a lot of what informs that work and the interest in that has been my upbringing in the Midwest. I'm from Kansas City, Missouri originally. And when I got to DC, I quickly found I was one of the few Midwesterners who worked in national politics. It was like, it was like spotting an albino, squirrel or something when I came across somebody else who was from the Midwest. And over the past decade or so, especially since a lot of that overlapped with the start of the Trump era, I started to kind of notice how the parties were changing over time, ideologically, demographically, and just doing the data analysis work that I did, I could kind of see how this was playing out at a very fundamental level. And I started to become more interested in that kind of work and looking at those things. It led me to, I come from the Democratic side of the equation. I started to see over time some behaviors or specific attitudes from people who had been sort of in my party for a long time that I felt like were not very productive, that I thought were, I mean this in the most objective sense, but kind of ignorant of other kinds of people who didn't see the world the way that they did. And it's, so I started kind of taking keen interest in studying that, figuring out why that was, how did that overlap with how the Democrats had been losing support in certain parts of the country and certain voters who had supported them for a long time, for many decades in some cases. Mm-hmm. And then it also got me interested in this sort of more macro level questions about political polarization and the root causes of that, what have been the consequences of that, both electorally and socially. So I find this all interesting in a very intellectual sense, but I also think there are very real consequences to all these questions, and so that hence my interest in all.
Yeah, and I mean, one of the reasons I wanted to talk to you was because I've followed some of your writings, especially I think on what you see as a danger with our political polarization. That it's not just, oh, well, people don't speak to one another anymore. Isn't that sad? But that it can have really dire consequences for us as a nation. And the thing that really kind of made me want to talk to you is this survey that just came out recently from Pew that had the United States alone among all the nations that they surveyed, where people viewed their neighbors basically dangerously, especially if they had a differing political opinion. And I guess I'm kind of curious what you kind of thought about that and thought about that survey, and how did we get here is probably maybe
Yeah.
a one question I have.
Yeah, it's pretty alarming. I think it's one of many data points that kind of paints this picture of an America that's sort of coming apart a little bit, just at least culturally, politically, and to your point, and maybe we can touch on this in a minute, but there are a lot of real world consequences to kind of this estrangement between America's, two political parties or political tribes, if you want to think of it that way. I think there's a lot of stuff that has underpinned this. The things that often jump out in the research and that I just see even in my own day to day life are that it's kind of the atomization of American life in so many ways. We don't have to interact with really anybody that we don't want to
Hmm.
interact with anymore, whether it's in the real world or online or elsewhere. Set aside politics for just a second. You don't have to leave your house on a given day just to live your life. You can order stuff to your door, food or groceries. You don't have to go to the movies to see a movie. You can stream it on your TV. You can get a lot of stuff on your computer. And so, this is sort of the Robert Putnam thesis of bowling alone. Over a long period of time, many decades, we've kind of retreated more and more inward. We have fewer close friends. We have fewer social connections, these kinds of things. And, as that has happened, we have become less acquainted with our neighbors. We don't know as much about them. We don't know, necessarily, we don't have a clear, accurate picture of what they believe, how they view the world, or why they believe those things. And what fills that void oftentimes is cable news, it's social media, it's caricatures or stereotypes. And so, this has happened both in the real world and online. And it's made it very easy for a lot of Americans to kind of self-sort into comfortable spaces. And that increasingly means be around people who share your politics, never have to interact with people who don't share your politics. And the way this gets dangerous is that when you don't know people, you don't understand them. And when you don't understand them, it's much easier to see them as a threat, especially in the political arena where questions of power are at stake. And so, I think I think people who are out there right now doing work to figure out how to repair a lot of these broken bonds, it's desperately needed right now. Because I think right now, from all the trend lines I've seen, there's very, very little at the moment that is giving me hope that we are kind of the pendulum is swinging back a little bit, other than people's, kind of widespread exhaustion with just being angry all the time.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things this is an interesting weird aside, but I sometimes wonder about the decline of the mall. And I'm a Gen Xer, a kid of the 80s. I remember that was a time when malls were just crowded. There were lots of people there. Uh, people gathered at a mall. And it wasn't like, necessarily they knew one another, but they were outside. They actually had to deal with people. Um, and malls, especially in the United States, are kind of dying. And, we usually say, well, of course, that's about things like Amazon, and there is some truth to that. And the problem with that is that you don't ever, I mean, I will admit I order stuff on Amazon, but then you don't have to deal with someone. You don't have to talk to someone.
Right.
Um,
Right.
and as much as people have maligned malls, they still brought people together. And I feel like online stuff doesn't always, I won't say it never brings people together, but it's really
Sure.
easy to never have to deal with anyone.
Sure. Yeah. And I mean, at the risk of sounding like a total Luddite, who'd never be on social media. I'm obviously on social media. I think there are certainly communal benefits. I mean, there are people who maybe have a hard time connecting in the real world, but they can find a community online. I think that's great. But for a lot of people, there is nothing that is a adequate substitute for that real world connection. And yeah, malls are a great example of this. And it's just a common space where you will run into other people in the real world, and you will meet strangers, you'll meet your neighbors, people in your community, right? People who you can just strike up a conversation with because of the fact that you live in the same place and you know some of the same people, or, whatever it might be. I remember reading at sometime last year, that people were kind of drawing a link between growing suburbanization, reliance on the car, living in single family homes, in these kind of sprawling nondescript suburbs and, all parts all of the country, as a reason why some of this might be happening where, whereas, urban societies for, ever, people kind of had to go into a shared space in person, walk around, go to a market, go to, work, whatever it might be. You were inevitably going to come into contact with other people. And in some of these sprawling suburban areas, you don't have those central locations anymore. You don't have, a little historic downtown square with restaurants and cafes and places where you can just go mingle with people. And some people want that, they want the space. In some ways that is kind of the American dream, right? That you can have, a nice car and not have to take public transportation, or you can have your own large home on a plot of land and you don't have to be in a, building with, dozens of other people, right? But I think we're kind of seeing that over the long term now, the pendulum has swung in a way where the trade-offs of that lifestyle for a lot of people are that we just come into contact with people a lot less, not to mention all the technological advancements, automation, these kinds of things. And so what I love to see, and I live in the Atlanta area right now, and I've seen this in some of the suburban communities outside of Atlanta where they're starting to build these are areas that have grown, precipitously in the last couple decades. But that it was just kind of, normal suburbanization. It was just a lot of these subdivisions and stuff. And now a lot of them are starting to create their own, town centers, these greens and places for people to convene, which I think is great. And so, you can kind of maybe have your cake and eat it too. You can have the quiet home and the quiet suburb and have your car and stuff, but you also have an opportunity to come out and meet your neighbors. And I think that's great. I hope we see more of that. I think that's one of the ways where we can kind of start to restore some of these bonds.
Yeah, I think I've seen that in some of the suburbs here in the Twin Cities. And I think one of the things about the suburbanization is that, when it happened in the 50s and 60s, there were still, I think, other things that could tie you to a larger community. Whereas I think, today there's very little, if anything, now.
Yeah, it's very true. There's there was a documentary, I think it came out last year, or the year before, called Join or Die. And it was based on this new movement that came out of Robert Putnam's research about how people are kind of less associated with each other in like formal associations. You used to have, scouts and youth sports and the Kiwanis Club and the Rotary Club, and all these civic organizations, churches, which I know is probably very near and dear to you, where you would have these opportunities to, if something in your life wasn't going well, you had a community to fall back on, right? Like you just knew that was there for you. And over time, participation in a lot of these organizations has gone down, and, there's probably any number of reasons for that. But I think, this is one of the things, maybe if we're looking for signs of hope, of how we can kind of reconnect with people, I think, there's a lot of research right now that Americans at kind of record numbers are feeling lonely, feeling isolated. And, whether they're thinking about this in broader terms of, the need for the importance of community, it's still important to them in their daily lives, right? If you don't have a community that you can fall back on, if you're going through a hard time, it's even harder because you feel like you're by yourself. And so that gives me a little hope that, out of kind of our own self-preservation, we will start looking for, more ways to build out this community, whether it's building kind of a town center, or reinvigorating some of these civic organizations, reinvigorating churches. I know there are some people who are working on kind of trying to do that and give people a place to go and just be with other people, but also, kind of have some time to be a little bit introspective. So I think that's all great. And I hope that we see, more of that in the years to come.
So, one of the things I remember, and you probably do too, but this is now hard to believe 18 years ago, was the book, um, the Big Sort. And I thought that was a really great book to talk about how things, basically how, especially how we were sorting ourselves out politically, how much America in many ways had changed. And as I said, that book came out 18 years ago.
Yeah.
Which is almost another universe. And this is still an issue. We're still talking about it. Why are we so almost resistant to wanting to reach across the aisle to talk to someone who may be different from us? What is kind of keeping us from doing that?
Yeah. There's a lot of ways I could take this. I think one is opportunity. I think a lot of people, there was last 2024. It was actually just before the 2024 election. The New York Times had a very interesting analysis that kind of builds a little bit off of the Big Sort, where they looked at the changing migration patterns of Americans domestically since COVID, and they looked at it on the basis of politics. So they were basically looking at people who moved from one place, went to another. What was the partisanship of that first place? What was the partisanship of the new place? And what they found was that in a lot of ways, we were self-sorting ourselves into more further and further into places that kind of reinforced our own politics. So Democrats, might move, if a Democratic family was moving, they might move from a neighborhood that voted for Biden by 12 points to another neighborhood in another city that voted for Biden by 23 points. Same thing with Trump voters kind of in the other direction. And what was interesting was that they said it's not necessarily that people are intentionally sorting themselves on the basis of politics. They're not necessarily saying, I want to go somewhere that's even more blue or more red than where I'm from. Some people may. But a lot of what informs our politics is also kind of our culture and like what the things that we just kind of care about day to day. So if you're a Democrat, you might appreciate being someplace that is more walkable, that has public transportation, where you can get any number of different kinds of cuisine for dinner. If you're a conservative, you might be more interested in space, having a large plot of land that's near a wooded area or something like that. And so we're kind of, even subconsciously sometimes, adding to that part of political segregation just because of other factors that kind of are upstream from our politics. And so, people might look around and say, well, maybe I'm actually interested in trying to get to know people who have different politics from me, but I don't see any near here. I live in a very politically homogenous area. So I think that's one reason. And another reason I think is, again, this kind of gets to what we were talking about at the beginning, where when we get more estranged from people who think differently from us, then we stop kind of understanding why they do. And I saw this a lot in my Democratic social circles, where especially after Trump won his first election, a lot of the people who voted for Trump were not in our social circle. So a lot of my friends did not know those kinds of people. And so it was easy to just stereotype, to kind of be dismissive and to conclude, okay, Trump is this way. He's mean, he's has bad morals. He's ignorant, whatever. That must mean that all the people who voted for him are the same. And if that's the case, why would I even want to interact with them? If they were okay condoning certain behaviors or, whatever the reason for their vote, then they're a bad person. And why would I want to vote for them? And I've heard from and talked to conservatives who think the exact same thing about Democrats. And I think part of what has happened is we convince ourselves that just because somebody thinks differently, they're automatically bad, that they must be motivated by bad intentions. They must, genuinely like having bad morals. And if we kind of can take a step back for a second and think about that, doesn't really make sense. Most people arrive at their views because they think these are the right views, these are the moral views. But it's hard to kind of see that in the fog of political conflict. And so a lot of people end up just convincing themselves, well, actually, it's not even worth engaging with people on that side because they're just bad people. And like, I don't have to do that if I don't want to. I'm going to stay here with the good people. And that, I think, leads to where we are right now, which is a lot of confusion and lack of mistrust. And just it's hard for people to understand each other.
Does the fact that the parties themselves have become more homogenous also play a role? And I know this is probably somewhat up your alley with the Liberal Patriot, is that the parties maybe 30, 40 years ago seemed a lot more diverse. You had still very moderate to liberal Republicans. You had more moderate to conservative Democrats or pro-life Democrats. That you don't have that anymore, that the parties seem to be a lot more ideologically pure.
Yeah. And it's sort of the duality of a two-party system, you know.
Mm-hmm.
It's funny, there was a political science report, I think it was back in the 50s or the 60s,
Oh
where the
yeah, I
political
know which one you're talking about.
scientists, yeah, they encouraged the two parties to make themselves more distinct from one another, that this overlapping was a problem and it wasn't good for democracy. And over time, that is exactly what happened. And this is kind of the result of it. And whereas in other countries, especially a lot of European countries that have different kinds of electoral systems, that make it likelier to have more than two political parties, here you've pretty much got two options. You know, if you end up being an independent voter or a third party voter, in most cases, you're guaranteeing that your vote is going to waste. And so most people, by necessity, end up identifying with one of the two parties, and it reinforces this idea that there's two tribes at war, basically. And just as our kind of tribal evolution has led us to think, it's made us very. Let me rephrase that. Our evolution has made us very tribal. You know, we've been tribal creatures from, the dawn of man. And, when we see another tribe, it kind of internally, our minds tell us, well, that tribe maybe is not to be trusted. Maybe they're a threat to people like us. And when especially when it's that black and white, there's one side and there's another side. It makes it easier for people to kind of just say, if you're not with us, you're with them. And if you're with them, then you're not to be trusted. You're a problem. If you're with us, you're protected. But also, if you're with us, you are with us the whole way. And there is less room and flexibility for you to have an original opinion or to kind of stray from the fold on an issue that we care a lot about. For Democrats, there's quite a few issues you could probably tick off where that's the case. And for Republicans right now, the biggest one is you have to be in favor of Trump. If you're in favor of Trump, you can probably believe in any number of other things. If you're not in favor of Trump, you're not welcome here. And so, I think that sort of the party system being what it is here, where you don't really have any robust third or fourth or fifth options, it just reinforces this idea that there's two sides and that if you're not with us, you're with the other side.
Yeah, I mean, I always think when I hear about that survey from the political scientists back in the 50s, it's like, yeah, I wish you could see how that turned out. Didn't turn out so well. Do you, for someone who thinks, okay, political polarization isn't a big deal, how is this damaging to American democracy? I think we talk a lot about how the other side is threatening American democracy, but how does political polarization itself weaken our democratic tradition?
Yeah. Well, for countries to be healthy, they have to have some shared sense of a national identity. We can see this all throughout, history. Societies where the tribe or the group identity is stronger than the national identity, those are societies that often end up in violent conflict with one another, whether it's a civil war or a genocide or anything else. Countries that have strong national identities tend to not be at risk so much of those kinds of things. And look, it's hard. It's hard to, especially in our current era where people are so migratory and societies, especially Western societies, are becoming ever more diverse. You've got people of different religious faiths, different ethnicities, a whole gamut of identities living together, trying to figure out not only how to coexist, but what do they have in common with one another. And I don't think there's any society that's really figured that out. I do think something that gives me hope for the U.S. in this regard is that we are one of the only modern nations that was founded on an idea as opposed to a specific identity. And it makes it so that, these immutable characteristics sometimes that keep people divided and that make them think you're on that side, I'm on this side. If your national identity is wrapped up in looking a certain way, speaking a certain language, having ancestry within a certain set of borders, it's hard for anybody else to ever feel like they are fully part of that. And when your society starts changing, that can feel really destabilizing. I think one of the things, it may not feel like it right now with all of the fights that the U.S. has had over immigration, but the fact that the U.S. has been a country of immigrants since its founding, and that has made it, even though we've had dark chapters of, nativism and rejecting new waves of immigrants, I do think it has made it a little bit easier for us to figure out how to manage immigration. I mean, you really don't have a party right now, unlike in parts of Europe, that says we don't want any immigrants, period. That is our policy. That is our platform. We may look at kicking people out just because they aren't true, Germans or true Frenchmen or whatever. You don't really have that here. You do have people who are very strict about immigration, but even to listen to most Republicans and to look at polling data on this, I think More in Common, who studies political polarization, recently had a survey of Trump voters, and they asked about legal immigration, and it was upwards of 80% said, no, we're totally fine with legal immigration. In fact, we support it. Like our concerns are about illegal immigration, right? Not following the rules, not enforcing the border, this kind of thing. All of which is to say, I think for the U.S., it gives me some hope that we have an ability to overcome these immutable characteristics that in other places might make it so that we don't feel like people who look different from us or who think different from us or pray differently from us are truly American. What really matters is shared support of the ideals, set forth by the founders, the ideals of the American dream, working hard, playing by the rules, freedom and equality, these kinds of things. And again, it's not perfect. Everybody has different notions of what these things even mean, right? But that gives me some hope, that over the long run, we can overcome some of these more tribal battles that we're fighting right now and find a way to kind of embrace a broader national identity.
Where do you think, I'm trying to, how to ask this, but how bad could it get is what I'm actually trying to get at. And I think because you kind of have talked about that in a few different articles that this could get bad. What does that look like? Because I think sometimes we kind of talk about this as if, it's a bad thing, but this could lead to something bad. And what does that look like?
Well, I know that there are, you can see it in polling data. There are certainly fears that the U.S. could go through another civil war. That would be the worst case scenario. Civil war, breaking apart, splitting. I think we are such an integrated country now. We don't have northern states and southern states. We have, if anything, it's sort of big urban areas, metropolitan areas, and, more sparsely populated areas is kind of the divide. But you have a lot of Democrats who live in red states, who live in rural areas. You have a lot of Republicans who live in major metro areas and blue states. So I don't think that is a realistic future. Having said that, and we've already seen some of this, there is absolutely a risk of sustained political violence. We've seen, or politically motivated violence. We've seen assassinations of high profile figures or assassination attempts. We've seen, different groups, fighting on the streets, especially back in 2020. You would see, images coming out of Portland of Proud Boys, and BLM protesters, right? And I think in a scenario where things get even worse, you'll see a lot more of that. You will see, the violence escalating to the point of probably deaths. The thing is, for folks who want to get a good glimpse of what it could look like, there was a movie from a year or two ago called Civil War. And it was really well done. It was by the director Alex Garland, and he deliberately took a nonpartisan lens and just said, this is what daily life could end up looking like in America if it were to devolve to that point. And what was interesting was that, a lot of the fighting, a lot of the violence was between active groups, right? Groups who were very highly political, were on the front lines kind of fighting for power, power struggle. But there's a scene where he shows the main characters kind of driving through a small town, and they get there and it just looks like, wow, this place has been untouched. Nothing bad is going on here. And then they start to notice little signs that even places like this town that they were going through life has changed. Even if you don't think that, political violence will end up impacting you, it really does at some point reach everybody, and it starts to disrupt daily life, and you can't just go about your normal business. And so that's, I think, when people think about, well, why does this matter? Like, is this going to impact me? Things may seem like they're faraway problems, but if we were to get to that place as a society, I don't think there would be many Americans who could just say, I'm going to kind of live my normal life, and, you guys kind of deal with the problems. It may seem like that in ways, there will be people who will be more caught up in that kind of stuff. But, I think that's the, the worst case scenario is this widespread sustained violence. And I don't think anybody wants that. I mean, I think most people don't see their neighbors as such a threat to their livelihoods that they would be willing to take up arms against them. Even if they're annoyed with them, even if they don't get them, even if they think that they're bad people. But it doesn't take much to light that fuse and for that stuff to spread. So I think that's what we have to try and stave off. That's why this stuff matters. Dealing with polarization, this kind of Cold War, if I would maybe call it right now, before it gets to that.
Yeah, I mean, what you're describing, and I didn't see Civil War when it came out, but it almost sounds more like Northern Ireland or Lebanon, probably until the early 90s, in that kind of sectarian kind of violence, that it wasn't, regimented armies as you would think the Civil War was, but it's literally kind of street to street kind of nasty kind of, of violence.
I think happening. The troubles are a great analogy, for sure. You had two very clearly defined groups that, they weren't segregated along a clean line, north and south, but neighborhood by neighborhood. And, that lasted for a long time until people were finally tired of just fighting all the time and the death and the destruction to their communities and stuff. So I think the hope for societies like the U.S. and other Western societies that are also dealing with their own kind of tribalism and polarization is that we learn from history and kind of stave that off before it gets to that.
Okay, so we've seen what could happen. How do we prevent it? What are some ways of trying to lower the temperature?
Yeah, there's a lot. So one of the things that I found helped me kind of better understand people who were on the other side of a lot of political questions for me, and also to kind of see them more clearly for who they are, was to try to, the first thing I did was I diversified my news. It sounds like a small thing, but it's a very doable thing. I think for a lot of people, we kind of talked earlier about how we've, in the real world, segregated politically, into kind of more blue areas, more red areas. And so, to kind of find ways to talk to people in the real world, it can be hard if you're looking for people who think differently from you, but we all live online lives, or most people. And so one of the things that I did, and this was shortly after Trump won the first time around, so that, I've been doing this for almost a decade now, was I diversified my news feed. I diversified my social media feeds. Not all of them, but I tried to kind of force myself to be exposed to people who thought differently from me. And it over time has had the effect of allowing me to, steel man, term people know, straw manning. Steel manning is seeing another person's point of view in the strongest possible argument, making the strongest possible argument. That kind of helped disabuse me of a lot of the kind of caricatured ideas that I had of people on the other side. And, you must only think X because you're a bad person, or you must think this view that you don't actually think. And it kind of helped me realize, there are a lot of very smart people who have different views than mine. It's probably worth engaging with those. So that's one thing. There are also a lot of organizations that people want to actually find opportunities in the real world, to just kind of break bread with people who are a little bit different, but to do it in, kind of a safe environment where, you're not starting on edge. There are a lot of organizations that are trying to foster those dialogues and bring people together. One of the ones that I have started to try to get involved with is called Braver Angels. And they have actually a methodology for reds and blues, Republicans and Democrats, to talk together in constructive ways that academic studies have actually shown leads to depolarization. And I think one thing people get a little confused about, and I want to be very clear about this, when we're talking about depolarization, we don't necessarily mean changing all of your views, holding hands, and singing kumbaya. In any society, whether it's politics or religion or culture or whatever, you're going to have disagreements, and that's okay. And actually, that's a good thing in a lot of ways, especially for the societies to develop and to grow. What these efforts do is it's just trying to get us to see our opponents, maybe not even as opponents, but as neighbors who think differently, right? To see them clearly for who they are, to try to understand their motivations. A lot of times, by the time we're, at each other's throats, we have, sometimes years or decades of life experience and moral reasoning and a lot of other things informing those conversations to the point where it feels like we're speaking a different language. And so a lot of these groups are doing great work to try and just get people to understand, just to understand each other, just to hear each other out. They're not set up to be like debates. At least this is the way that Braver Angels does it. And there are a lot of other organizations that do similar work that I think is great. And I think it's important for people to know about and to, hopefully get involved with in some way.
Do you have some hope that we can kind of tackle this that's in the long run?
I do have some hope. I would say day to day, my hope meter changes a little bit. Yeah. I think, look, one thing that would also help, and this goes to maybe the previous question, is national leadership. I mean, one of the things that is really difficult right now in this period in American history is whatever you think about Donald Trump, he is a uniquely polarizing figure. And I think both his detractors and his supporters could acknowledge that. And one of the things that I think is less helpful personally in how Trump conducts himself is that it seems oftentimes like he actively looks for ways to antagonize people who are not in his camp, people who aren't in his tribe. And a lot of this, if we're looking to our leaders for some guidance of what's okay to do, what's permissible behavior, what's not, that kind of stuff, I think lends itself to worsening of these sort of intertribal relations, if you will. There are leaders, I will say, there are several, especially governors. Some that come to mind are Spencer Cox, a Republican of Utah, Wes Moore out of Maryland, Josh Shapiro out of Pennsylvania, who understand that this is a problem. I mean, the National Governors Association took on political polarization as their issue for the last couple of years. So there are people who are very well attuned to this, and I think the more that we can see that from our leaders, I think the more it will create permission structures for average citizens to start thinking, maybe this is worth my time too. Maybe some things that I've done or some things that I've said have contributed to this problem. So there's those kinds of things. I think, in our social circles, try in the same way that, especially on my side of things, among liberals, we might talk about how, it's not okay to make certain derogatory comments about somebody on the basis of their skin color or on the basis of their sexual orientation or their religious beliefs or whatever. We should kind of think about that similarly to when we're talking about people who have different political beliefs. That's harder because that's often wrapped up in questions of morality, but there are healthier and less healthy ways of talking about people who are different in that regard. I've been in a number of situations where I've heard people make fairly ignorant comments about people that they don't know. And those are the kinds of, opportunities where I think we can talk to our peers and, at least try to lower the temperature a little bit and to bring a little bit of clarity to some of those conversations and lessen hostilities. So, there are definitely things that I think can help in that regard. But it's hard work, and I think it's good to be clear-eyed about that as well.
Final question is, do you think, looking into the next few years, and especially as we have midterms coming up and presidential elections in 2 years, do you see opportunities where we can come together, or is it going to be rough sailing over the next few years?
I think there certainly will be. I mentioned earlier, I think something that may finally force this conversation to give is that there is a large chunk of the country that is just exhausted. They're tired of feeling outraged and angry and like they can't just talk to people without politics, pervading and infecting their conversations. And so I think there's there's an appetite for, these kinds of changes. Can those happen on the thorniest of culture war issues? I don't know that we will see that in the next couple of years. I think that's going to take time. I do think there will be opportunities, and people kind of, I think, sometimes don't realize there are still bipartisan issues out there, and there are new ones forming all the time. And I think one of the ones that has been of interest to me because it's relevant to this conversation is about social media and smartphones. You see this at the state level. I mean, there are red states and blue states and purple states that are realizing that there are destructive effects of this technology. Like, they have some utility, but they've also created all kinds of problems, especially for young people. And they're starting to come together to implement new policies that I think have both the effect of helping with maintaining young people's mental health, but that also might help over time, kind of force us to scale back a little bit in how much all of us in our daily lives adopt, use social media or on our smartphones, and which are both kind of platforms for that can contribute to some of these problems that we're talking about. There's also, the coming impending effects of AI, on jobs, on really daily living in a lot of ways. And I think there is a pretty broad consensus that people are a little bit nervous about that. And it's another opportunity, for people who maybe don't see eye to eye on a lot of things, to talk to one another and figure out, hey, how can we come together and work on this? One of the things that a lot of literature finds that is very helpful in breaking down some of these divisions is when people come together and find a task to work on, and to partner on, right? When you're doing that, you're trying to achieve a goal that's bigger than your own individual or group identity, and you're working with other people in pursuit of that goal. This is why during times of war, historically, there has been a lot more domestic harmony in societies, because you're working together in pursuit of a goal like that. And so, I think whether it's the smartphone issue, whether it's AI, whatever else it might be, I think finding opportunities and projects for people of both sides to be able to find common ground and work together on, I think that might offer us our kind of first openings for, healing some of these divides and trying to kind of, rekindle these bonds that held us together for so long.
Okay. Well, I think that is a good note to end on, that there's a difference between optimism and hope. Optimism is kind of that it's going to be a happy ending, but hope is believing even it might be rough, there's still possibility. And I think it's good to know there is still possibility, that all isn't lost.
Yeah.
So,
yeah.
Well, Michael,
Without
thank
hope,
you so much.
It's very hard. Yeah.
Oh,
thank you.
It's impossible.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Michael.
Thank you, Dennis.
So I hope that you found that discussion helpful. I will have links to a few articles from Michael about this topic in the show notes. And I'm really hoping I can find someone. I want to find someone that I can talk to about political polarization from a faith perspective, because I think that is important too. This is an issue that I think is becoming a bigger issue. It's an issue that is affecting the church, especially when we talk about things like Christian nationalism. So I hope that this is a discussion that we can continue, especially from a faith perspective. And I am really thankful for Michael to join me to talk about that to begin. It's funny that I don't know Michael's faith background, but it's funny that he has a quote on his profile on Substack that, to me, actually is somewhat important, where he talks about the importance of what it means to kind of reach out to people and to know each other. And I think he has his quote, which I've heard before in other contexts, and it's basically, in politics, as in religion, you can either spend your time hunting for heretics or looking for converts. And I think in our culture right now, we have far too many people that are hunting for heretics, both in our churches, but also in politics. And neither of those are good. And I hope that we can find, excuse me, more people who are willing to look for converts. So, as usual, if you have any questions or comments, send me an email at churchandmain@substack.com. If you want to learn more about the podcast, listen to past episodes, or donate, check me out at churchandmain.org. You can also visit churchandmain.substack.com to read related articles. And also, please consider subscribing to the podcast on your favorite podcast app. And I hope that when you do that, that you would leave a rating or a review, because that helps others find this podcast. Also, just to let you know, I am still considering and thinking about moving podcast hosting. That will probably come sometime later in April, but just to let you know about that, to give you some time. If you want to make a donation, you can do so by using the link in the show notes. And also you can use a link to make sure that this episode gets into your email inbox. So that is it for this episode of Church in Maine. I'm Dennis Sanders, your host. Also, just a quick reminder, there will be no episode next week, which is Holy Week. And usually these episodes, they've been coming out a little bit late because of Lent and some things that I've been doing. So that's why they've been coming out usually on Saturdays. But next week, there will be none at all. And then we will have our next new episode for the following week. So again, I'm Dennis Sanders, your host. Thank you so much for listening. Take care, Godspeed, and I will see you very soon.